E como é que você encontrou? Porque você tem, né, cada personagem tem um diferente tema. Como é que você encontrou esses temas? Como é que foi o seu processo de trabalho e de preparação?
You know, it's a kind of chaotic beginning for me because I'm a little different than most documentary producers in that I put all my money and my time in the beginning, in research, in talking to people, reading books, just thinking, pre-interviewing people. I put an enormous amount of time into that. And in almost all of my films, with the exception of this one, for reasons I'll explain, I write a script before I shoot anything. You know, I know what people will say. I know the themes I'm going for. I know the act structure, and it flows. This one, I didn't quite have the luxury of doing that because their schedules, a dying person's schedule, is very different. I mean, I move around their schedule for obvious reasons, but still I read enormously. I would talk to people in hospitals or publishing houses or go online or go to conferences, and word of mouth, and I would hear about all kinds of interesting people, and then I would go after them, and then they would know another 10 people and another 20 people. And you know, the challenge for me is different than a written, you know, a journalist, because I have to find people who are not only sort of, whose story is not only emblematic and thematically right, they have to speak with a kind of poetry and precision that brings in the viewer. It's a kind of a combination of qualities, and you can find someone who's, and so many people were so helpful to me, but they wouldn't have been able to communicate for other reasons. And then every so often, after meeting or talking to 20 or 30 people, then you meet this extraordinary person who can just bring the idea alive. And then, of course, I knew that it had to be more than a collection of interesting stories and powerfully and poetically expressed. I needed to touch on the representative narratives. You know, I mean, they were not exhaustive, but I needed to touch on a narrative of science that offered solace, of love that offered solace, of religion that offered solace, or not. I mean, some of those narratives you saw in the film fell away. They had to create a new narrative, or science, or nature, or art. And those narratives were questioned, they were staying, but I needed, the Buddhist narrative, I needed after hearing all of these stories to really, if I only had the time for 9 in part 1, which you all saw, there's a part 2 coming up, there's another 9 stories, to at least feel that these were emblematic in some way, representative in some way, though not exhaustive.
Então, eu queria aproveitar, já que você falou que vai ter a parte 2 desse seu filme, ele é diferente desse primeiro? Quais são as novas narrativas que você está procurando? O que a gente pode esperar? Tem algum spoiler que você pode dar para a gente?
A little spoiler. The structure is the same. It will be people who have been shocked into mortality and have to find the narrative or rework it or find a new one that sustains them. And so that overall structure is the same, but then, first of all, the narratives are very different. I open with a science narrative, with scientists who are pushing back against death and saying, my narrative is to push death away, to live longer, to find the cure. So that's and that death is more of an enemy, or living longer is the goal. So it's a very different relationship to death. And that's the first half an hour in which the viewer is brought into that landscape of death being something you dance with very differently. And then I say, but meanwhile we die, and knowing that we are dying, what are those other narratives? And I explore the Buddhist way, the way of artists who find out art will not sustain them. and love will. The narrative of the lived life, that was a big one as well. The narrative of Judaism, the narrative of the Native American rituals that none of us know enough about, but sustained this woman. So there's another range, and it's quite different, so each part is self-contained. You can see them separately and not need to see the other, but seeing all of them together, I think is the ideal way. And I think they're stronger seen together as 4 hours, but each of them is self-contained.